Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Amy Lafave. I'm the local history librarian at the Lenox Library. Today's program is called Moving Lenox. I'm going to tell you about 17 properties that are no longer on their foundations where they started. And let me just let a few more people in. Okay. So we're going to start the program with a map that was drawn in 1891, but it was a map that was drawn based on memories that were 50 years old at that point. So this map is about 1841, 1842, and it's drawn by William Bartlett. He was a Lee resident, but he had lived at this point in Lenox, had very strong memories of Lenox, the courthouse, the neighborhood he lived in. And so 50 years later, he gives this speech at the chapel of the Church on the Hill, which is next to Lilac Park. And he talks about remembering all the people, where they lived 50 years earlier. And it was such a popular talk that he's asked to write up those memories, and he's asked to draw a map. So what you're looking at right now is that map that he's drawn we are in the courthouse. You can see Wilson's Hotel below that. Across the street is says H.W. Bishop. So speaking of H.W. Bishop, if you look at this circled location, that is on the corner of, it's got a road pointing to Richmond, that is West Street. And that is actually what we call currently the Adams Community Bank. We knew it for a long time as Lenox National Bank. But H.W. Bishop is Judge Bishop. He lives there now. Later, he will build a house across the street, and Professor Thomas Eggleston will move into that house. Professor Eggleston is a descendant of Azariah Eggleston, whose father-in-law, John Patterson, is the original builder of this house. Now, Bartlett, he actually had his memories printed. He talks about these different places, and he talks about them as they were when he was a young man and as they are 50 years later. So for instance, he describes this house. He just describes it thusly: move the Bishop Eggleston house up near the street again, where it used to stand. Remove the piazza and dormer window, and you can see it as it was in the olden times. So that tells you right there that this house used to sit closer to the street. And here's a picture of the Adams Bank as it is today. So imagine this, it's probably about 20 feet closer to the street. This happens more than once. Roads widen. People don't want to be so close to the street. There's various reasons for people to decide that it's a good idea to move the house. But we'll see a little more of that later. Some moves are a little more substantial than just moving away from the street. Prime example is the house of Charles Sedgwick. This is on Bartlett's map. on the corner of Walker Street and Church Street. He is the clerk of courts for the courthouse, moves from Stockbridge in about 1821, and decides at one point that this is getting a little congested on this corner. So he's decided to move his house down the street. Nini Gilder does this great job of describing this move. She's quoted, it's in her Hawthorne's Lenox book, and I'd like to read that bit because she's quoting a letter that Charles wrote to describe the move. He describes it as a condemned criminal between heaven and earth, unworthy of either. Took a week to move this house down Walker Street. It blocked traffic. But up to this time, the people are marvelously good-natured, and I've not heard a word of reproach or complaint. Well, this is 1851. Charles Sedgwick by now is a beloved figure in Lenox, so no one's going to complain about Charles. And then it finally makes its way to its location. The cable, strong as a 74's, was fixed behind, and into this breaching, Tubbs tackled himself. It proceeded safely until it got within 12 feet of the brink. The cable snapped. "By God," said Tubbs, "she's gone to hell. Throw under, throw under." All hands fled in consternation but two. Parker and one other man threw stones and blocks before the rollers. The stones were ground to powder, the blocks ironed out like wet sheets. Parker in peril of life, but within 2 feet of the brink, she finally, almost miraculously stopped. And Saturday afternoon was safely lodged and is now leveled on the prettiest spot where she is to stand. I was actually kind of surprised in doing the research for this program today that there weren't more descriptions like that to describe some of these other houses. But I think that's just very evocative. And here's a picture of Charles on the left and his wife Elizabeth Dwight Sedgwick on the right. His wife ran a very famous school for girls, included Harriet Hosmer, the sculptor, and Lady Jerome Churchill, the wife of Randolph Churchill and the mother of Winston. And here's the house as it's made its final destination on what is now Kemble Street, but at the time Kemble Street was not built yet. And it is called the Hive. Charles will invite his sister Catherine, the famous 19th century novelist, to move there with him, and the view is spectacular. It doesn't last forever. This picture is of Spring Lawn. Spring Lawn is built by the Alexander family, and they tear down the Hive to build this estate, but the view is the same. It's still gorgeous. Our next building that's moving is one that, as it turns out, moved twice. This is the Methodist Church in Lenox. If you are familiar with Lenox, we have a street called Church Street, and there are no churches on Church Street. But back in the day, at one point, there were two. The Methodist Church was built in 1834. In this woodcut by J.W. Barber that was drawn about 1840. If you look to the far left, you can see a building with a steeple. That's the Methodist Church. A little farther up the street, you see a building with another steeple. That is the First Trinity Church that was built in 1815. So the Trinity Church is the first church to be built on Church Street. In the Tucker manuscript, and when we talk about Tucker manuscript, this is a history of Lenox written by George H. Tucker, who had ancestors in Lenox and wrote this history of Lenox, which is currently close to a second edition because we've found additional information, additional chapters. So it's got a lot more information, and I'm really excited to have it published eventually. We're getting there. Christy Cordova, the information librarian at the library, is instrumental with the work that she's done with Jim Biancolo to make that happen. In that Tucker manuscript, it mentions that at some point, the Methodists decide that that end of Church Street, the character isn't really fitted for a church. It's becoming commercial. So they decide to move the church. And that move happens in 1851. And here is an 1854 map of Lenox. This is Lenox Village, and you can see where the Methodist Church has moved. It's actually moved to where the Sedgwick House used to stand. So it little switcheroony. Now there aren't many photos of that Methodist church. Here's a rare photograph. It's of Walker Street. You can see the Patterson Eggleston house at the end, the Adams Bank. Perhaps in the trees you can see a little bit of the Curtis Hotel, and then there's two white storefronts, and then on this corner you can see a building with some windows. If you zoom in on the top of that building, you can barely make out through the trees. There's a steeple. So that's where the Methodist Church used to be. And here in an 1894 map shows the third move. It's moved around the corner onto church. So now it's back on church. And here's a picture of the Methodist Church in its final destination. Now, what's interesting about this picture is that you can see the steeples on the side. And in fact, this picture has been mislabeled the Old Trinity Church, maybe because in the gable there's that trefoil design, and also in the circle it looks like a trefoil. But we've determined that it actually is the Methodist Church. And here's another clue. This is a part of Church Street. The dark building in the middle is the L.C. Peters store. And if you look to the very left of that, you can see the side of that Methodist Church. And if you remember the picture I showed you of Walker Street, you can see that window looks a lot more like that church. And in fact, here we're going to show you two parts of Sanborn Maps. These are can be found at the Library of Congress. This first map is from 1898. And if you look in the lower rightish corner, you see M.E. Church. It was formerly the Methodist Episcopal Church, not to be confused with the Episcopal Church. If you look very closely, you can see on that bottom edge, there's a little square in the middle. And I suspect that that is the original steeple when it was centered over the church. And here's the same Sanborn map, except in 1911. And now if you look at that M.E. Church in the bottom corner, you can see that there's a steeple now in that same location. There is an article in the Berkshire Eagle that indicates in 1908 that the Methodist Church roof is reslated. So my guess is that's when the steeple was relocated. So not only do we have moving buildings, but we have moving steeples. So here again is our Methodist Church. And here's what it is today. It's the sheer design building on Church Street. Bit of a change. Doesn't look the same without its steeple, wherever it was. And just to be clear, that here is a picture of the first Trinity. This is I've taken this picture from a book by John Gable, the History of Trinity Parish. Wonderful book. And you can see by this present day picture, again, steeple is gone, but you can see that this roof, the roof line is similar. So you're looking at the Wick Gallery. Now, this is actually another building that moved because L.C. Peters moved it a few feet on the property, made a new foundation. Not sure why, except maybe he wanted a stronger foundation for his building, but it adds to the list. Now, the churches were never side by side as churches because by the time the Methodist Church moves to Church Street, the new Trinity Church is built on the corner of Walker and Kemble. And that is built on what was known as Lyman's Corner. Lyman's Corner, there's a rumor that the Minuteman men from Lenox trained for Revolutionary battle there. The Episcopalians buy this property and build Trinity Church, but there's a house, Mr. Lyman's house is still on the property, and it is moved next door to the Methodist houses so that so that Trinity can build a new rectory for their rector. And it's built on where this house used to stand. So this was moved around the corner and next door to the Methodist Church, and it serves as the parsonage for the Methodist minister. So very ecumenical folks in Lenox. In Bartlett's description of where the Methodist Church first lived, and it's not here. It's not here because this map predates the building of the Methodist Church. You can see the Episcopal Church, but not the Methodist. This is from 1831. Bartlett describes the church being built across from the ore beds. Now, if you look in that lower left-hand corner, you'll see like a hash mark, and it says iron ore. That was an iron field. There was another ore bed where Ore Bed Park is now. So I was trying to figure out where exactly the Methodist Church would have fallen in between those two ore beds. It turns out that there was another ore bed field, and it was across the street from the Episcopal Church. It was in the lot behind the house that says George Tucker in the middle of this 1854 map. George Tucker has leased his property behind his house to the Lenox Iron Company. Lenox at the time, and may still, have rich deposits of iron ore, and they came in handy making cannons for the Revolutionary War, Civil War, other iron works. The iron furnaces themselves were in Lenox Furnace, which we call Lenox Dale, but the iron itself was mined in the center of town. There was a vein that ran from the ore bed field, which we now call Ore Bed Park, through the center of town, and eventually out to where that iron ore field was on Under Mountain. So across it's across from Stoneover Farm today. And one of the lines ran under George Tucker's house. So he allowed the iron company to start mining behind his house, and that produced disastrous results. This is an article from the Berkshire Eagle from 1861. You can see it says caved in. The iron shaft is now starting to cave in next to his house. A subsequent article in 1862 tells us it's not just the ore line behind the house that caves in, but the house itself drops down 15 feet into the ground. And in fact, in 1946, here's another Eagle article recounting that story. You can see the title, "Lenox Underground Still Keeps Residents Jumpy." And in fact, here's a clip from that article. "The surface around the house recently occupied by George H. Tucker and family, together with the house, has settled so much that Mr. T's family left in a hurry for a more permanent foundation. The ground is settled more than 15 feet on the south side of the place." So this is recounting that earlier story. "Raised from the mine, the house was moved and survives today on School Street, remodeled into a double house, and the home of John Broderick, employed in Clifford's store, and William T. Lahart occupies the other half." So, believe it or not, this house was pulled out of the hole and moved down and around the corner to what's now called Old Central Way. So it's moving from Main Street down Housatonic Street around the corner and on that side street. And here's a picture of that house, same house today. It's a duplex. We're not done building on that site, even though we've pulled the house out. Speaking of the Cliffords, here's the James Clifford block built over that same mine shaft. Anyone who's followed any bit of Lenox history knows that James Clifford and Sons are the preeminent builders of the estates in Lenox. They have a furniture, hardware, and paint store. This location is not a lucky location. Unfortunately, this is the location where the 1909 Easter Sunday fire originates, because of the hardware store and the paint store, there's turpentine and other oils stored there, and it's believed that that was the cause of the fire. It burns out 6 buildings in downtown Lenox, causes loss of life. It's when we start,
You want Tylenol?
Well, I got it with me. I just don't know if I should take
fire department.
Is your phone here?
I believe somebody needs to be muted. Is that possible?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, just turn.
I don't know how to do it, Mom. I've been trying.
Are we trying to mute?
Me.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let's see if I can do that from my end. All right, anyone else need muting here? I think we're good. Okay. Back to our regularly scheduled program, folks. James Clifford's son, not to be detoured, rebuild after the fire. So here's the new Clifford's block in the same spot. And this is from 1910. This is from a publication that highlights the business owners in Lenox, Lee, and Stockbridge. But it doesn't, this too doesn't last forever. And here's the spot today. Probably safest to leave it as a parking lot and not try to build any more on that lot. I understand there are stories when the building that's now houses Nee James was built, there was more sinkholes to be found. So downtown Lenox is sometimes a little tricky proposition. Okay, our next building to be moved, and this is one where I'm not completely confident. I've discovered in my travels that when you're relying on newspaper articles and also information from various historical sources, sometimes those details can get mixed up, confused, not quite. There's some certain things that call it into question. Here is an article from the, I believe it's from the Berkshire Eagle. It's describing the Williams house. We're back to L.C. Peters again. He likes to move houses. And it's, you can see it's been sold to L.C. Peters and it's going to be moved to Stockbridge Street. He's going to tear down the old Quincy house on Stockbridge Street. It's indicated as being one of our old landmarks. And here's where it's located on the Bartlett map. This would be what Triangle Park is today. Now, Daniel Williams used to own the Lenox Coffee Shop, which is now the Curtis. And a Calvin Burnham was a tavern owner and ran a tavern in this spot. And Calvin had his eyes and hopes on the coffee house, so they made a switch. But Daniel Williams is still a successful tavern owner. In fact, at one point there were 7 taverns in the town of Lenox when it was the county seat, because those lawyers got awfully thirsty. And it became somewhat of a landmark. So when the property was purchased by Mrs. Kingsland to put her house on that property, people were concerned. So the story is that L.C. Peters bought the house and moved it to Old Stockbridge Road. And here's where that location is today. Now, the reason why I question it a little bit is the way that this Williams Tavern is described looks nothing like the Rookwood Inn. This is very Victorian. However, it would not be the first time that someone had completely remodeled a building beyond recognition, as we will see later. Now we're looking at the First County Courthouse. It later became the Old Town Hall. When the Second County Courthouse, now the Lenox Library building, was built. And it's in this picture, it is on the corner of Walker and Old Stockbridge. This map of 1791 of Lenox has in its center, you can see where it says State House. That is the county courthouse. A little up the way, you can see upside down, it says Meeting House. That would be the church on the hill, but not the current church on the hill, because that's not built till 1806. You can see there's a jail a little down a piece. That's Old Stockbridge Road. And here's another J.W. Barber woodcut. This one's a little earlier. It's probably from the early 1830s. You can see the this old town hall on the corner. The Curtis Hotel to the right of that. The courthouse / Lenox Library building to the left of that. There was a jail and a public house. So they had a hotel / jail. That is awfully convenient, I guess. Across the street from that jail would be the Lenox Academy building. If you look in between that old town hall and the Curtis hotel. I believe it's calling it Wilson's Hotel at this point. You can see the spires of that First Trinity Church. If you look at that picture of the old town hall, you'll see that the door is actually facing Old Stockbridge Road. This local lore has it that it was placed on a cannonball and turned a quarter turn, so then it was facing Walker Street. So that actually, I don't know if that really counts as a move, but it will move a little more substantially than that. The building was built in 1792, and it survived in that location for 200 years. But at some point, the town decided it wanted a new town hall. So, and they wanted to build it in the location where this building stood. So they made plans to move the house, move the building. At that time, the post office was located in that old town hall. So there was a little bit of a, where is the post office gonna go story. So this article in 1901, Postmaster George Burns sprung a surprise by buying the old post office building. And it indicates here that they're gonna move the building east. So farther down Walker Street. By 1902, the plan has changed. We're going to move it even farther. We're going to move it around the corner onto a lot on the corner of Housatonic Street and Church Street. And they're preparing that lot. But there's a little bit of a snag. This is going to involve taking trees down, and the property owners aren't too happy about that. So the purchasers of the building decide, well, maybe we won't take it all the way around to Housatonic Street. Maybe we'll leave it on Walker Street. And so there's a vacant lot about where the old Talbot's building is now. And they start excavating for a foundation. Well, that does not sit well with the Cottagers, because it's going to interfere with a view. And so Cottagers are displeased, they're up in arms. So the owners of the building say, all right, we'll go through with our original plans. And here's a picture of that move. This has got to be has to be my favorite picture in our library collection. You can see the new town hall on the right, Curtis on the left. You're looking down Walker Street, and in the middle of Walker Street is that old town hall just before it's about to make the turn onto Church Street. And here is that building today on Housatonic Street. Thank you, Google. It's hard to get a current picture of the buildings on Housatonic Street without getting a bunch of folks walking through town in cars. So this is the best I could do. As I said before, the post office location was definitely a discussion. L.H. Regnier wanted a piece of the action, and he proposes that it go in his store on the corner of Franklin and Main. The Cottagers don't like that idea either, so it ends up not being there. And here's a picture of that Regnier block on the corner of Franklin and Main. It is currently open space next door to what's currently the Win Stanley building on Main Street. But at the time it housed his businesses, and he rented it out to other business owners. Now, to make room for this building had to be moved. It was moved 60 feet around the corner. It is Mrs. Washburn's house that used to be next door to the house that was the Winstanley business. At the time, it was her sister, Mrs. Henry Sedgwick's place. And Renier buys the lot, moves the house around the corner. Okay. Our next house to move is the Servin house. You're looking at a picture of Main Street, Lenox, and I'm sorry about I'm sorry if anyone's having trauma looking at all that snow. I'm not in a hurry myself. You can see the Marshall Sears house on the right, and if you look on the left, that first house with the porch is the Servin house. Next door to that is the chapel of the church on the hill, and next to that is the Academy building. Now, why is this house in need of moving? Oh, and here's a closer look at that house, so you can see the structure. You can see the dormers. The town wants to use that area, that lot, to build a new high school. The high school has been held in the Academy since 1880. The Academy had closed, and Lenox was running out of room for its students, so they made use of that building. But it was itself getting a little too worn, so the town decided it was time for a new high school. And they thought, what better place than to put it in the center of town? So Richard O'Brien buys that Servin house for $50, and is going to move it to Fairview Terrace. Fairview Terrace is now what we call Tucker Street. There's a subsequent article that describes some more trees having to take down to accommodate this move. This move is taking place in about 1908. And here's the house in its present location on Tucker Street. You can see the dormers. The porch doesn't reach all the way across anymore, but this is the house that again made its way from Main Street down Fairview and up Tucker. Now, in a recurring motif, the Cottagers are not really pleased with this location. They're also not pleased at the choice of architect. There were two architects in the running to build the new high school building. A man by the name of John Greenleaf, who was related to Richard Greenleaf, who owned the Windyside Estate, which is the current Lenox Club, and John Donahue, who had just recently built the St. Vincent de Paul Church in Lennoxdale in 1904. They're not happy with the choice by the town, which had a special town meeting to make the decision. They picked architect Donahue. So the Cottagers, John Parsons writes a petition. Taxpayers of Lenox, who together pay a large part of the town taxes, join in earnest remonstrance at the action taken and proposed to be taken about a high school. It's a remarkable document in that it's signed by 4 pages worth of signatures. You can see Richard Greenleaf on this page, Grenville Winthrop of Groton Place, Dr. Jakes of Undermountain Road, Home Farm, Edward Wharton, the husband of Edith Wharton, Robert Patterson of Blantyre, among others. Here's another page. Now we do have some, it's not just cottagers, we do have some residents of Lenox who aren't happy about the idea either, including Elizabeth Clifford, at the Rockwell brothers, Francis and Robert. But here's another list. We have Thomas Fielding on here, and we have George Tenor of the Beaupre estate. We have W.D. Avery, who owns a store in Lenoxdale, and we have Jean Van Ness Foster, who has signed along with her husband, Gerard Foster, on the first page of Bellefontaine. And then there's one more page, which includes Mrs. John Sloan of Windhurst, and Edith Wharton is also on this page. So the document itself, it reads like a cottager list with with some, you can also see how the town, mostly the businessmen of the town, working together with the cottagers to see if they can affect some changes. The petition suggests that Mrs. Jessup of Belvoir Terrace, she's offered to buy a lot on Housatonic Street. It is part of the George Morgan estate, Bentford Hall. And she's offered to buy the lot from Morgan and donate it to the town if only the town will move the high school there. Here is a map of the George Morgan estate. This is from the 1904 Atlas of Berkshire County. You can see Bentford Hall in the lower right-hand corner. Across the street is the Bel Air estate and another parcel. And then across from Housatonic Street, where the Berkshire Street Railway is running, is the lot in question. So the town agrees with that plan, but they stick with architect Donahue, and they build the new high school on that lot. And here's a picture of what our old timers, our natives would call the old high school. It's the Cameron House on Housatonic Street. Now, we now have a vacant lot in the center of town that is of no, has lost its intended use. So there's a discussion, what do we do with that house? This clip, pardon me, I just want to make sure I get these citations right. This is from the Berkshire Gleaner of 1909. A prominent Lenox lady makes the suggestion that the ladies of the town purchase the servant property and build a casino. While the men have a club, there's no central gathering place for the ladies. And on the right is Berkshire Eagle article of 1912. John E. Parsons, again, someone who says, I don't want the school here and I'll put my money where my mouth is. He's agreed to lay out the park as lay out the property as a public park and erect a fountain. I have not found pictures of this park with a fountain, but you all know this park as Lilac Park today. You'll see this article is titled Lenoxdale, $36,000 appropriated from new schoolhouse. And you will see if you read further, John Greenleaf gets to build a school. He gets to build a school in Lenoxdale. And here's a picture of that school, which is still standing today on Crystal Street. Well, speaking of schools, here's the Lenox Academy. In 1880, to make sure that it will be suitable as a use as a high school, there's repairs done to the building, but it's also, according to records, moved 20 feet and the records say that it's moved 20 feet south. Now I have a little question about that, because if you look at the building today on Main Street and go 20 feet north, it seems like it's going to be sitting in the porch of the house next door. So I'm not sure if they meant like magnetic south, or did they just mean away from the street? But that is another one of those slight moves. And speaking of the Morgans in Ventford Hall, here's a picture of Ventford Hall, which was built in 1892. But in order to build Ventford Hall, they had to do something with the building that was there before. This is Ventford, all one word. I mean, two words, Ventford Hall, Ventford's one word. The Haggertys own Ventford, one word without the hall. This is where their daughter Annie Haggerty honeymoons with Colonel Robert Gould Shaw 3 months before he leads the Mass 54th in the failed Battle of Fort Wagner. Well, this is where Morgan wants to put his mansion. So instead of tearing it down, we move it across the street and a little down the way. And if you remember the 1904 map, that Bella property is where Ventford was moved and rechristened. So this is the Bel Air property moved across the street. It does burn in the 1960s, and this is where the Morgan Manor condominiums are today. Back on Main Street, here's a picture of the two, what are referred to the Elm Cottages, built by G.G. Haven and rented out to various summer residents. The one on the corner at one point was rented out by William Skirmahorn, and the next door house was rented out by his daughter, Mrs. John Innes Kane. That house next to the library will be willed to the library to be torn down and made into a reading park, which is the Roach Reading Park today. But the house on the corner is now owned by F.C. Haggard. Here we are with Postmaster George Byrne again. He would like to move that house. He'd like to move it back 24 feet. But Haggard will keep the lot because he wants to build a 3-story building. And here's the building that he builds. So here's Haggard's drugstore. It's currently the home of the Lenox Chamber of Commerce. And if you look to the left of the building, you can see where the cottage has been moved, and it's currently the home of the Heritage Tavern. So we keep our taverns. Now, I mentioned the Williams Tavern before, and how that Rookwood Inn would have had to undergo some drastic changes in order to be the same house. Here's another house that underwent drastic changes. This is Butternut Cottage. It is the cottage of Miss Kate Carey, famous for her love of horses and her horsemanship. She is the niece of Mrs. Grace Carey Coon, who owns the cottage above Butternut on the corner of Main and Greenwood, Hillside. Now, this house is rumored to be the Titus Parker house, built in 1770. And this house is rented to various people over the years, including in 1842, the court crier Joel Davis. he would have been the one who would be responsible for saying, "Oyez, oyez, order in the court." And he rented this house. Here's the house as it's been remodeled. As you can see, this does not look like a 1770s plain house. It's got very pointed gables, but you can also see that it's pretty close to Main Street. Well, I mentioned that Carrie was a lover of horses and of riding them. Nothing was worse to the equestrian than the advent of the auto car. And the cars would be driving down Main Street and they would have to start gunning their engines to get up the hill to Church on the Hill, belching smoke and all other unpleasantries. So she decides she's going to move her cottage. And she moves it underneath, quote unquote, underneath the hill of her aunt's place. That's why I think, even though it looks like on various maps that this cottage was closer to Triangle Park initially, I think she not only moves it back, but she moves it a little farther north, closer to the hill of Church on the Hill. You can see this article says that one Sunday in August, 4,700 automobiles passed the cottage. That's a lot of cars in 1912. And here's the cottage today. You can barely make it out in the trees. It's set quite a bit farther back. It's currently the Garden Gables Inn. So we're about to wrap up here. We have another Davis. This is not Joel, this is Zephaniah Davis. And his house is purchased in 1874 by the man of Dave Roach. The Roaches lived there until the turn of the century, at which point Elizabeth Clifford, remember Elizabeth, purchased the property. Now, some of this is based on Roach family lore, because I was able to find evidence that the Clifford sisters bought this property and that they built this house here in 1915. I don't see any evidence of anyone moving the Roach house to place this here, but the family history says that it was indeed moved, and it was moved to Maple Street in Lenox. Also, because of the size of the house, making it up Church on the Hill in order to go down Hubbard, the house was cut in half. And this is a picture from our assessor's database. I don't think, even though there's a ladder, I don't think this is when the house was being moved, although it does have that little bit of a look. But you can see how this house does look like perhaps it was cut in half before moved. There are more buildings, I'm sure, and I ran out of time to dig more. For instance, this house on Church Street, according to records, used to live where the library building is now, and when the county decided to place their second courthouse here, they moved this street, this building. And I didn't get a chance to research the Willows Cottage. This is a wonderful picture from the Lenox Historical Society's website. It is currently the Roach Funeral Home. There's Roaches again. And if you look at that on the right, it's awfully close to St. Anne's Church. I don't know if you can see through the trees. If you look carefully between the two buildings, there's a bit of a steeple and a cross. That's the old St. Anne's before it was torn down. But where that house is located, it looks like it's where that land is now before the grotto, but I didn't have time to actually discover whether it was moved or not, and I don't have any records indicating that it did. But boy, pictures tell 1,000 words, don't they? So William Bartlett's map was pretty handy, and it's amazing how many houses moved on that map, either just by a little or by a lot. So thank you for coming.